The wind cutting through the frontier town of Oakhaven didn't just chill the skin, it scraped against the bone. It was the kind of bitter, unforgiving cold that drove sensible men indoors to huddle around cast-iron stoves. But this morning, the muddy, frozen square was packed with thick-coated men, their breath rising in ragged white plumes. They hadn't come out into the biting frost to buy winter supplies. They had come for a spectacle. Clara Vance stood on a raised wooden platform in the center of the yard, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. She was 24, completely orphaned, and currently being appraised like a prize heifer. She wore a faded blue cotton dress that offered zero protection against the howling wind. The left sleeve was torn cleanly at the shoulder seam, exposing her pale, goosebump-covered skin to the sleet. It was a brutal reminder of how Blackjack Corvan's men had dragged her out of the boarding house an hour earlier, ignoring her pleas. In her trembling right hand, her knuckles bruised and white, she tightly clutched a torn piece of ledger paper. It was the debt voucher her late stepfather had signed. $80. That was the price of her life. $80 clears the ledger, Blackjack Corvan shouted, pacing in front of the platform. He was a thick-necked man in a heavy buffalo coat, his voice carrying easily over the whistling wind. The girl goes to the highest bidder to work off the balance. Strong back, decent teeth, and she knows how to scrub a floor. Who's starting the bid at 50? Clara stared straight ahead, refusing to look down at the men. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cold was a physical agony, turning her bare fingers blue and numbing her bare feet inside her thin, worn leather boots. But the humiliation was worse. The men looked at her with hungry, calculating eyes. They whispered among themselves, exchanging crude jokes and spitting tobacco juice onto the frozen mud. She knew these men. She had washed their clothes and scrubbed their plates for 3 years. Now they were bidding on her as if she were a piece of discarded property. "I'll give 40 if she knows how to keep her mouth shut," a miner yelled from the back, prompting a chorus of ugly laughter. 50, a saloon owner countered, tipping his bowler hat. "I got a back room that needs cleaning, and she looks desperate enough." Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She would not cry. If she cried, they won. She clutched the torn ledger papers so hard her fingernails dug into her palm. She was entirely alone. There was no law in Oakhaven that cared about a penniless woman, and there was no mercy in a winter starved of resources. 50 going once, Corvan yelled, smiling greedily. At the edge of the crowd, a shadow shifted. He didn't announce his presence, but the men standing near him naturally drifted apart, stepping back as if avoiding a sudden landslide. Silas Thorne stood a full head taller than anyone else in the square. He was a massive, towering structure of a man, clad in a heavy, weather-beaten canvas coat, lined with thick sheepskin. His dark hair brushed his collar, and his deeply tanned, square-jawed face was locked in a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness. He had ridden into Oakhaven for salt and black powder, intending to leave before the incoming storm hit. But his dark, watchful eyes were fixed on the fragile woman on the block, shivering in her torn blue dress. He saw the violent shaking of her shoulders. He saw the sheer, desperate dignity in her stormy grey eyes as she refused to look down. 50 going twice, Corvan bellowed, raising his wooden gavel. 80. The voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant rumble that cut through the wind and the crowd noise with the finality of a falling tree. Every head turned. Corvan stopped, his gavel hovering in midair. Silas stepped forward. His boots crunched heavily against the frozen mud. The crowd parted entirely, leaving a wide path for the giant trapper. Men who had been laughing a second ago suddenly found an interest in their own boots. The mountain man known as Silas Thorne was a myth whispered about in the taverns, a solitary survivor of a dead expedition, a man who lived high in the bitter peaks where normal men froze to death. Silas reached the edge of the wooden platform. He didn't look at Corvan. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked up at Clara. From her vantage point, he looked immense, terrifying. But as his dark eyes locked onto hers, she didn't see the hungry calculation she had seen in the townsfolk. She saw a quiet, unmovable anchor. Silas reached inside his heavy canvas coat. He pulled out a thick leather pouch and tossed it onto Corvan's ledger table. It hit the wood with a heavy metallic thud that spoke of solid gold dust and unminted nuggets. "Count it," Silas commanded. "The debt is paid." Corvan hesitated, intimidated by the sheer size of the man, before greed took over. He untied the pouch, his eyes going wide at the weight of the gold. "Well now, Mr. Thorne, looks like you just bought yourself a servant." "I didn't buy anything," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a quiet, lethal warning. "She's not for sale. She's leaving." Before Corvan could reply, Silas stepped onto the first rung of the platform. He didn't ask for permission. He reached up, grasped the heavy collar of his sheepskin-lined canvas coat, and pulled it off his massive shoulders. Underneath, he wore only a thick wool shirt, completely ignoring the freezing wind. He stepped up beside Clara. She flinched, her body instinctively shrinking away from a man of his size. Silas stopped immediately. He didn't touch her. Instead, he opened the massive coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. The sheer weight of the garment almost buckled her knees, but the immediate, enveloping warmth was a shock to her system. It smelled of wood smoke, pine pitch, and cold leather. "Put your arms through," he murmured, his voice softening just enough for her to hear. Clara, too stunned to speak, slid her numb, bare arms into the massive sleeves. The coat fell to her ankles, swallowing her fragile frame entirely. It hid her torn dress. It hid her trembling. For the first time all morning, she felt a barrier between herself and the cruel world. Silas turned his back to her, standing between her and the crowd, shielding her entirely from the biting wind. He pulled a white iron pocket watch from his vest, glanced at the frozen hands, and slipped it back. "We need to walk," he said without looking back at her. "Storm is breaking the ridgeline in 20 minutes. Keep behind me." He stepped down from the platform. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. She looked at Corvan, who was busy pocketing the gold, and the townsfolk, who were watching in stunned silence. Then she clutched the lapels of the giant coat and followed the mountain man. They left Oakhaven without looking back. Silas walked with long, measured strides, deliberately slowing his pace so she could keep up. The town faded into the swirling white mist as they hit the timberline. Within minutes, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind shifted from a howl to a deafening roar. The whiteout hit them like a physical blow. The snow fell so thick and fast that Clara couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of her. The only thing guiding her was the broad, solid expanse of Silas's back, a dark shape against the blinding white. Her legs, weakened by hunger and shock, began to give out. The snow drifted up to her knees, making every step an agony. She stumbled, her boots slipping on hidden ice. She hit the snow hard, the breath knocking out of her lungs. Silas stopped immediately. He turned around, his dark hair plastered with snow. He saw her on the ground, struggling to push herself up, refusing to ask for help. The storm screamed around them, a lethal reminder that the frontier had no mercy for the abandoned. The storm did not merely fall, it attacked. The wind roared through the pines, a deafening physical force that sought to strip the heat from their bones. Clara lay in the knee-deep snow, her breath shallow and erratic. Inside the massive sheepskin-lined canvas coat, she was shivering so hard her vision blurred. She tried to push herself up, her frozen fingers sinking into the powder, but her muscles simply refused to answer. Hunger and the morning's profound shock had finally drained the last of her reserves. Through the blinding whiteout, a massive shadow loomed over her. Silas. He didn't shout over the gale to ask if she was all right. The frontier did not reward wasted breath. He knelt in the snow beside her, the wind whipping his dark hair across his weather-beaten face. Without a word, he slid one massive arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her as effortlessly as if she were made of dry kindling.
I needed that.
Clara gasped, her hands instinctively clutching the thick lapels of his coat, which he was now wearing. Her knuckles brushed against his chest. Even through his wool shirt, he felt like a wall of solid granite, radiating a deep, furnace-like heat against the freezing air. He adjusted his grip, securing her securely against his chest, and turned his face into the biting wind. He began to walk. For Clara, the journey became a disjointed blur of sensory extremes. The shrieking of the wind against her ears contrasted with the steady, powerful thud of Silas's heartbeat beneath her cheek. The smell of the blizzard, sharp, metallic, and deadly, was overpowered by the scent of pine pitch and worn leather clinging to him. She closed her eyes, her fist still fiercely curled around the torn piece of the auction ledger inside the oversized pocket. Every instinct she had developed in Oakhaven told her that men only took what they could use. She was waiting for the catch, for the moment he would demand his payment for the gold he had thrown on the auction block. But as the miles dragged on, Silas only tightened his protective hold, his large body absorbing the brunt of the storm so she wouldn't have to. It felt like hours before the wind's pitch suddenly changed, breaking against something solid. Silas stopped. Through the swirling white, the dark, rotting silhouette of a building emerged. It was an abandoned stagecoach station, a decaying relic of a bankrupt route, half swallowed by the mountain drifts. The roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and several windows were boarded shut, but the heavy oak door remained intact. Silas shifted Clara's weight slightly, raised his heavy leather boot, and kicked the door near the latch. The frozen wood groaned, then gave way with a violent crack, bursting inward in a cloud of dust and snow. He carried her inside and quickly kicked the door shut behind them, dropping a heavy, rusted iron bar across the frame to seal it against the wind. The sudden absence of the storm's howl was deafening. Inside, it was pitch black and possessed a damp, bone-deep chill. But the lethal bite of the wind was gone. Silas walked carefully through the gloom and gently set Clara down on a heavy, dust-covered wooden bench. "Stay," he murmured, his deep voice echoing slightly in the empty room. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in the thick sheepskin collar of the coat. She listened to him move. He navigated the dark with frightening, predator-like efficiency. She heard the scrape of heavy boots, the clatter of iron, and then the sharp strike of a match. A tiny flame flared, illuminating Silas's stark, angular face. He held the match to a bundle of dry moss he had pulled from a watertight pouch at his belt. He shoved the burning moss into the belly of a massive, rusted cast-iron stove that sat in the center of the room. He fed it carefully with twigs, then thicker pieces of split pine that had been left behind by forgotten travelers. Within minutes, a fire roared to life. The heavy iron of the stove began to tick and ping as it heated, radiating a glorious, life-saving warmth that pushed back the shadows. The flickering orange light revealed the main room of the station. It was rough and utilitarian, plank floors, a few broken chairs, and a long counter. Silas walked over to the bench where Clara sat. He crouched down so he wasn't towering over her, his dark eyes scanning her pale face. He unhooked a leather-bound metal canteen from his belt, uncorked it, and held it out. Drink this. Clara reached out with trembling hands. The sleeves of the giant coat hung far past her fingertips, so she had to awkwardly bunch the canvas up to take the canteen. Her left arm, underneath the heavy coat, still bore the torn sleeve of her blue dress, a ghost of her morning's humiliation.
Thank you.
She drank. The water was icy, but it cleared the fog in her throat.
No, I have
"Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp.
Pick it up.
Silas didn't reply. He took the canteen back, corked it, and stood up. He walked over to the darkest corner of the room, near the barred door, and began arranging a few empty burlap sacks on the floor. Clara watched him, her cynical heart still bracing for the inevitable. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He paused, looking back at her over his broad shoulder. "Why did you pay Corvan?" she asked, the words spilling out before her fear could stop them. $80 in gold. No one pays that for a scrub girl. What do you expect me to do for it?" Silas turned fully around. The firelight cast long, harsh shadows across the rugged terrain of his face. He looked at her frail form, swallowed by his coat, clutching the bench as if she expected him to strike her. His heavy brow furrowed, a flicker of something deeply painful crossing his usually unreadable eyes. "I didn't buy you," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "A man doesn't buy another human being. Corvan was going to let those animals tear you apart. I just paid the toll to get you out." He walked over to a rotting cabinet, pulled out a thick, slightly dusty wool blanket, and walked back to the stove. He laid the blanket out on the floor directly beside the radiating heat of the iron. He pointed a calloused finger at the makeshift bed. "Sleep where it's warm," he instructed. Then, without another word, Silas walked back to his pile of burlap sacks by the freezing, drafty door. He sat down, stretching his long legs out, and leaned his broad back against the heavy oak wood. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes fixing on the glowing embers of the stove. He was placing his own body as a physical barrier between her and the brutal world outside. He had no coat, he had no blanket, but he didn't complain. Clara stared at him for a long time. In Oakhaven, men took the best for themselves and left the scraps for the weak. This giant of a man had given her his coat, his water, and the fire, while he took the freezing floor. Slowly, she moved off the bench and lay down on the blanket near the stove, pulling his massive canvas coat tightly around her like a fortress. Exhaustion, Finn, ally dragged her under. Hours later, the deep, terrifying howl of the blizzard outside woke her. The fire had burned down to glowing red coals, casting the room in deep crimson shadows. Clara shifted on the hard floor, the warmth of the iron stove still pressing against her back. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, and looked toward the door. Silas was not asleep. He was sitting exactly where he had been, his back against the oak planks. But he was leaning forward slightly, his massive shoulders hunched. By the dim red light of the dying fire, Clara saw him silently unrolling a strip of linen from his pack. He was wrapping it tightly around his left forearm. A dark, wet stain was seeping through the fabric of his sleeve, glistening in the faint light. He had been bleeding, likely from a jagged piece of the doorframe when he kicked it in, or from the hidden debris under the snow. He hadn't made a sound. He hadn't asked for help. He just sat in the freezing draft, quietly binding his own wounds, keeping watch over a woman he owed absolutely nothing to. Clara lay still, her hand finding the torn piece of ledger paper in her pocket. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of being utterly alone in the world began to fracture. Morning broke over the Bitterroot Mountains not with warmth, but with a pale, icy blue light that seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The deafening roar of the blizzard had settled into a low, steady moan, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and absolute. Clara woke slowly. For a moment, the scent of dust, old wood, and pine pitch confused her. Then, the memory of the auction block, the biting wind, and the towering mountain man crashed over her. She sat up, clutching the massive sheepskin-lined canvas coat around her frame. The fire in the rusted cast-iron stove was crackling cheerfully, radiating a steady heat that had kept the freezing death of the room at bay. Silas had not slept. He was standing by the long, decaying wooden counter on the far side of the room. He had already reinforced the broken door with a heavy wooden plank he must have pried from the back room. Now he was methodically shaving thin slices of dried elk meat into a blackened tin pot resting on the stove. He still wore only his heavy wool shirt, his broad back to her. In the daylight, Clara could clearly see the strip of linen wrapped tightly around his left forearm, the dark red stain having dried to a rusty brown. Clara watched him in silence, her mind conditioned by 3 years of scrubbing floors in Oakhaven for men who only took and never gave, raced to calculate the angle. He had paid $80 in gold for her. He had carried her through a whiteout. He had given her his coat, his water, and the fire. Men did not do these things for free. She pulled the edges of the giant coat tighter, hiding the torn, frayed left sleeve of her blue cotton dress. She was waiting for the moment he would turn around and demand the ledger be balanced. As if sensing her gaze, Silas stopped his work. He wiped his hunting knife on a piece of burlap, sheathed it at his belt, and turned. His dark, watchful eyes met hers. He didn't smile. His face seemed entirely unaccustomed to the gesture. but his gaze was stripped of the predatory hunger she was so used to seeing in men. It was simply assessing, making sure she was alive. He picked up a chipped tin cup, dipped it into the pot on the stove, and walked over to her. He stopped a respectful 3 feet away, crouching down so his massive frame wouldn't tower over her, and held out the cup. "Drink," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Broth'll get your blood moving." Clara hesitated. She reached out from the folds of the oversized coat. As she shifted, the deep pocket of the canvas coat sagged, and a small, crumpled object fell out, fluttering to the dusty floorboards between them. It was the torn piece of the auction ledger. The silence in the room suddenly felt suffocating. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. That piece of paper was the physical proof of her humiliation. The document that stated she was property, worth exactly $80. Silas looked down at the scrap of paper. Then he looked at Clara's trembling hand. He didn't ask what it was. He knew exactly what it was. Slowly, deliberately, Silas reached out with his large, calloused fingers and picked up the paper. Clara braced herself. This was it. This was the moment he would remind her of the debt. She lifted her chin, her stormy gray eyes flashing with a desperate, battered dignity, ready to fight if he reached for her. Instead, Silas held the paper out, offering it back to her. "I told Corvan the debt was paid," Silas said quietly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I didn't say I bought it." Clara stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. Silas nodded toward the cast-iron stove, its orange flames licking at the iron grating. "Paper doesn't own people, Clara. Throw it in." He knew her name. He had heard Corvan shouting it on the block, and he had remembered it. Clara looked from his rugged, scarred face to the torn ledger in his hand. Her fingers trembled as she took the paper from him. She stood up, the heavy coat dragging against the floorboards, and walked the 3 steps to the stove. With a sharp exhale, she tossed the ledger into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into ash in less than a second. A profound, staggering wave of relief washed over her. Her knees suddenly felt weak. She wasn't a servant. She wasn't an indentured girl working off a bar tab. She was just a woman standing in an abandoned stage station with a man who had asked for nothing. Silas stood up and handed her the tin cup of hot broth. "Drink," he repeated softly. Clara took the cup with both hands, letting the heat sink into her numb palms. She took a sip. The rich, salty taste of the elk broth was the best thing she had ever tasted. She looked at his left arm. "You're hurt," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "Your arm." Silas glanced indifferently at the blood-stained linen. "Caught it on a splintered door hinge. It's nothing." "It's bleeding," Clara corrected, stepping closer. For the first time, she didn't shrink away from him. "I know how to clean a wound. Let me look at it." Silas frowned, clearly unused to anyone offering him care. He looked like a wild mountain predator trying to understand a gentle gesture. He opened his mouth to refuse, but Clara was already setting the tin cup down on the bench. She reached out, her small, pale hands gently touching his massive, linen-wrapped forearm. Silas went entirely still, his muscles corded like iron beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. She carefully unwound the makeshift bandage. The gash was deep, angry, and sluggishly weeping blood, stretching 4 inches across his forearm. It needed to be cleaned properly before infection set in. "There's clean snow outside," Clara said, her practical survival instincts kicking in. I can melt it, boil it, and wash this out. Do you have extra cloth? Silas reached into his pack with his good hand and pulled out a clean strip of cotton. He handed it to her, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. He watched her work, noticing the stark contrast between her fragile, pale hands and his own scarred, weather-beaten skin. She was completely focused, her fear replaced by a quiet, capable determination. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't need to. His deep, resonant voice carried through the heavy timber with terrifying clarity. The debt was paid, Corvan, Silas rumbled. The girl is free, and the only thing you're taking back to Oakhaven is a shallow grave if you don't turn your horses around right now. A tense, brittle silence followed his words. Outside, Clara could hear the faint sound of boots shifting in the snow, the soft jingle of spurs. Then Corvan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You think because you're big, you're bulletproof, Thorn? Corvan sneered. Take the door, boys, put him down. Clara flinched as the sudden deafening crack of a rifle tore through the morning air. It didn't come from Silas, it came from outside. A heavy slug ripped through the rotting wood of the boarded-up window above Clara's head, shattering the last remaining panes of dirty glass. Shards rained down on the floorboards in a deadly, glittering shower, and the freezing wind rushed back into the room. The sharp, deafening crack of the rifle shot had barely stopped ringing against the timber walls when Silas moved. He didn't dive for cover. He became the cover. As a second slug tore through the rotting planks, sending deadly splinters flying across the room, Silas stepped directly into the line of fire. He raised the heavy Winchester to his shoulder. He didn't blindly spray bullets. His movements were terrifyingly precise. A cold and calculated lethality that spoke of a man who had survived 100 deadly encounters in the wild. He fired. The lever action of the rifle was a blur in his hands. Clack, boom, clack, boom. The roar of the Winchester inside the enclosed space of the stagecoach station was absolute thunder. It rattled the dust from the rafters and made Clara's teeth ache. The smell of black powder and sulfur instantly filled the room, thick and acrid, mingling with the bitter, freezing wind that was now howling through the shattered window. Outside, a man screamed, a high, sudden sound of agony that was abruptly cut short by the thud of a body hitting the deep snow. "Damn it! He hit Miller!" Corvan's voice roared, laced with sudden, panicked fury. The arrogant sneer was entirely gone. "Spread out! Take the back door! Don't let him pin us down!" Inside the station, Clara remained crouched behind a heavy oak counter, her breathing ragged. Shards of glass and jagged splinters of wood had rained down on her, but the massive sheepskin-lined canvas coat Silas had wrapped her in deflected them easily. She gripped a heavy Colt revolver with both hands, her thumb resting on the cold iron of the hammer, just as Silas had instructed. Her hands were shaking violently, but she did not drop the weapon. Silas ducked back against the solid wall between the windows. He quickly thumbed 3 more brass cartridges into the loading gate of the Winchester. His dark eyes flicked toward Clara, checking on her. "I'm all right," she called out, anticipating his unasked question. Her voice was strained but surprisingly clear. Silas gave a sharp nod. "They're flanking. Corvan is trying to divide my attention." He reached to his belt, unclipped a heavy leather bandolier holding 24 rifle rounds, and slid it across the dusty floorboards. It hit the base of the counter near Clara's bare feet. "Sort the brass. When I run dry, I'll need them fast. Hand them up, but do not expose your head." Clara immediately dropped the colt onto her lap, grabbed the bandolier, and began pulling the cold, heavy brass cartridges free, arranging them in a neat row on a low shelf beneath the counter. It gave her something to do, a way to fight back against the paralyzing terror. She was no longer just a passive piece of property waiting to be claimed. She was part of the defense. The heavy crunch of boots sounded from the rear of the station. Silas spun around, his long duster sweeping the floorboards. The back door of the station was older, weaker wood. It rattled violently as a heavy shoulder slammed into it from the outside. Silas crossed the room in 2 massive strides, entirely ignoring the crossfire Corvan was directing at the front of the building to keep him distracted. As the back door splintered inward, bursting off its rusted iron hinges, a hired gun stepped through the frame, a double-barreled shotgun raised to his hip. Silas didn't shoot. At that close range, the blast of a shotgun would have filled the room with buckshot, endangering Clara. Instead, Silas lunged. He swung the heavy, octagonal steel barrel of the Winchester like a brutal club. The steel connected with the gunman's hands and the shotgun with a sickening crunch of breaking bone and snapping wood. "Ugh!" The gunman howled, dropping the ruined weapon, staggering backward into the snowdrift. Before he could recover, Silas stepped into the doorway, grabbed the man by the front of his heavy coat with his good right hand, and hurled him backward into the freezing storm. Silas kicked the splintered door back into place and shoved a heavy oak barrel against it to hold it steady. But the distraction cost him. "He's at the back," Corvan yelled from the front yard. "Shoot through the walls." A volley of gunfire erupted. Lead tore through the dry, rotting timber of the station's front wall like paper. Silas turned, intending to dive back to the heavy central pillar, but he saw the trajectory of the bullets. They were ripping through the wood right at the height of the stagecoach counter, right where Clara was kneeling. "Clara, down!" Silas roared, the only time he had raised his voice. He didn't dive for the pillar. He threw his massive frame forward, placing himself directly between the incoming hail of bullets and the wooden counter. Clara dropped to the floorboards, curling into a tight ball inside the canvas coat, just as the wood above her exploded. Splinters rained down in a blinding shower, and then she heard it, a heavy, wet, sickening thud, followed by a sharp grunt of pain. Clara looked up, her heart stopping in her chest. Silas was leaning heavily against the counter, his Winchester slipping slightly in his grip. He had taken a hit. High on his right shoulder, a dark, terrible stain was blossoming rapidly across the fabric of his thick wool shirt, a terrifying contrast to the white snow blowing through the window. "Silas!" Clara screamed. He had taken the bullet for her. The giant mountain man, who owed her nothing, who had already bled from his left arm to break her out of a freezing town, had just thrown his body in the path of a bullet to keep her safe. One in Oakhaven. Men bled for gold. They killed for land. But no man had ever bled for Clara Vance. A fierce, protective rage suddenly ignited in her chest, burning away the last remnants of her fear. She didn't stay down. Clara grabbed the heavy Colt revolver, pushed herself up until her eyes just cleared the shattered edge of the counter, and leveled the heavy iron barrel toward the broken window where Corvan's voice had come from. She pulled the hammer back with both thumbs. She pointed it at the dark shape shifting in the snow outside, and she pulled the trigger. The Colt roared, bucking violently in her small hands. The recoil bruised her palm and sent a shockwave up her arm, jarring the torn sleeve of her dress beneath the coat. She didn't hit Corvan, but the massive .45 caliber slug shattered the wooden post inches from his face, showering him with lethal splinters. Corvan yelped, throwing himself desperately into the snow behind a frozen water trough. "Keep your head down!" Corvan screamed to his remaining man. "The crazy witch has a gun!" Silas breathed heavily, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. He looked down at Clara, who was thumbing the hammer of the Colt back again, her stormy gray eyes blazing with an unyielding, furious fire. Despite the blood pouring from his shoulder, a slow, genuine look of awe crossed his scarred features. He reached down with his good left hand, the one wrapped in the bloody linen she had tied, and gently pressed the barrel of her revolver down. "Save your rounds," he rasped, his chest heaving. "They're in cover." He slumped down so his back was against the counter, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor beside her. Clara immediately dropped the gun and reached for his shoulder, her hands hovering over the dark, soaked wool. "It went clean through," Silas grunted, his jaw tight with pain. "Missed the bone. I can still shoot." "You're losing too much blood," Clara said frantically, her fingers trembling as she pressed a fold of her oversized coat against his shoulder to stem the bleeding. "They're going to keep shooting until they tear this place down." Outside, the gunfire ceased. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. "Thorn!" Corvan yelled. His voice was no longer arrogant, it was vicious, high-pitched with desperation and rage. "You killed Miller. You think I'm going to let you walk away now?" Silas closed his eyes, his head resting back against the oak counter. He checked the chamber of his Winchester with one hand. "You can't shoot us all, and you can't stay in there forever," Corvan screamed. Then came a sound that made Clara's blood run completely cold. It was the heavy, sloshing sound of liquid splashing against the dry, rotting wood of the station's exterior walls. The sharp, chemical stench of kerosene drifted through the shattered window, instantly overpowering the smell of black powder. "If you won't come out," Corvan roared, the sound of a match striking echoing clearly in the frigid air, "then you can burn with her." Through the gaps in the boarded windows, Clara saw the terrifying, sudden flare of an orange torch igniting against the blinding white snow. The heavy chemical stench of kerosene choked the freezing air, sharp and entirely unnatural against the scent of pine and snow. Through the shattered window, Clara saw the orange flare of the torch. Corvan didn't hesitate. With a feral, desperate shout, he hurled the burning rag at the front wall of the stagecoach station. The dry, rotting timber caught instantly. A hungry whoosh of flame erupted, climbing the exterior wall with terrifying speed. Thick, acrid black smoke immediately began to curl through the broken window, stinging Clara's eyes and burning the back of her throat. "Silas!" Clara coughed, gripping the heavy Colt revolver. They were trapped in a wooden box, and Corvan was turning it into an oven. Silas pushed himself off the floorboards. His right arm hung stiffly by his side, the dark stain on his shoulder spreading further down his wool shirt, but his massive frame moved with a terrifying, singular purpose. He didn't look at the spreading flames. He looked at the heavy oak door. "He wants us out," Silas rasped, his breathing heavy and strained. "If we stay, we suffocate. If we run, he shoots us in the back." He reached over with his good left hand, the one Clara had tightly bandaged, and grabbed the Winchester from the floor. He couldn't shoulder the rifle properly with his wounded right arm. Instead, he wedged the stock firmly under his right armpit, supporting the heavy barrel with his left hand. It was a brutal, awkward stance, relying entirely on raw upper body strength to manage the weapon's heavy recoil. He turned his dark, intense eyes to Clara. "Stay low. When I breach the door, you put the barrel of that Colt through the window. You don't aim for Corvan. You aim for the man with the rifle covering him. Keep him down for 2 seconds. That's all I need." Clara nodded, her stormy gray eyes locked on his. She didn't argue. She didn't freeze. The torn sleeve of her blue dress brushed against the rough canvas of Silas's oversized coat as she shifted her weight, bringing the Colt up to rest on the splintered edge of the window frame. She pulled the heavy hammer back. Silas took a deep breath. He didn't wait for a countdown. He simply lunged. He hit the heavy oak door with his left shoulder, kicking the iron bar out of its brackets in the same fluid, explosive motion. The door flew open, slamming against the exterior wall with a crack like thunder. The freezing wind rushed in, feeding the flames on the porch, but Silas was already moving through the smoke. "Now!" he roared. Clara rose up from behind the counter, through the billowing black smoke and the falling snow. She saw the remaining hired gun kneeling behind a frozen water trough, raising his rifle toward Silas's massive silhouette in the doorway. Clara didn't flinch. She aimed the heavy Colt, closed her left eye, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked violently. The shot went wide, missing the gunman by a foot, but the massive .45 caliber slug shattered a chunk of ice right next to his face. The gunman flinched, ducking his head instinctively for a split second. That was the 2 seconds Silas had asked for. Silas didn't stop to aim. Firing from the hip with his one good arm, he worked the lever of the Winchester in a brutal mechanical blur. The rifle roared twice. The gunman was thrown backward into the snowdrift, his weapon spinning harmlessly away. Silas stepped off the burning porch and into the deep snow of the clearing. He was a terrifying sight. A towering giant emerging from a wall of fire, his wool shirt soaked in his own blood, his dark hair whipping in the wind. "Corvan!" Silas's voice was a low, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate the frozen ground. Black Jack Corvan stood near the tree line, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He had expected the giant to burn, or to stumble out coughing and blinded. He hadn't expected a demon of the mountain to walk through the flames and execute his last man in under 3 seconds. Corvan drew a silver-plated revolver from his coat and began firing wildly as he backed away. The shots were panicked and erratic. One bullet clipped the edge of Silas's coat. Another buried itself in a pine tree. Silas didn't even break his stride. He dropped the empty Winchester into the snow. He didn't reach for his hunting knife. He just kept walking, closing the distance with long, inevitable strides. Corvan pulled the trigger again, but the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He let out a pathetic shriek, dropping the gun and turning to run. He didn't make it 2 steps. Silas lunged, his massive left hand closing over the thick collar of Corvan's buffalo coat. He hauled the auctioneer backward with staggering force, lifting the heavy man completely off his feet before slamming him violently into the trunk of a massive pine tree. The impact knocked the breath out of Corvan. He slumped into the snow, gasping, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Wait, wait," Corvan begged, his voice high and shrill, completely devoid of the arrogant boom he had used on the auction block. He fumbled frantically inside his coat, pulling out the heavy leather pouch of gold Silas had given him that morning. He held it out with trembling hands. "Take it. Take the gold. It's all yours, Thorn. Keep the girl. Keep the gold. Just don't kill me." Silas stood over him. The snow was falling heavily again, catching in his dark hair and landing on his blood-soaked shirt. He looked down at the cowering man, then at the pouch of gold. In Oakhaven, gold was the only law. It bought silence, it bought land, and it bought human beings. But out here, in the bitter, unforgiving silence of the frontier, it was just heavy, useless metal. Silas didn't take the pouch. He reached down, grabbed Corvan by the lapels, and dragged him up until they were eye to eye. "She was never yours to sell," Silas growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, suppressed rage. "And